Speaker, today everyone can see what an utter mess this Labour government and this Labour Prime Minister have made of the British economy. The fastest rise in unemployment in our history, the worst recession since World War II, and the worst peacetime public finances ever known. As of today, any claim they have ever made to economic competence is dead over, finished. This Chancellor has just told us he will be doubling the national debt. He is planning to borrow £348 billion over the next 2 years. That is more, over just 2 years, than every previous government put together. Not just every government since World War II, not even every government since World War I. Every government since the Bank of England was first founded more than 300 years ago. This Prime Minister has certainly got himself in the history books. He has written a whole chapter in red ink, Labour's decade of debt. The Chancellor rattled through those figures for borrowing, so let me read them slowly. The government is set to borrow £175 billion this year, followed by £173 billion, then £140 You say you said it, you swallowed it. 100 and then 118 billion. That means that over a 4-year period, Britain will now be borrowing £606 billion. They talk about child poverty. With debt like that, our children are going to be in poverty for decades. It is a staggering amount, and the price will be paid not by the incompetent ministers who put us into this mess, but by families and businesses up and down our country. And I have to say, they will never forgive the people that have done this. Britain simply cannot afford another 5 years of Labour. And even these figures are massaged. If you look at page 204 of the Red Book, they are assuming that consumer demand is going to bounce back to pre-boom levels by 2011. That is what they're forecasting, and that's why they forecast the debt coming down as quickly as they do. This wouldn't be a U-shaped recovery, it'd be a trampoline recovery. And what is the Chancellor's excuse for these dreadful borrowing figures? Well, he just told us it's a world recession. Of course, other countries are suffering. But there's not one single other major country in the world in a position as bad as the United Kingdom. We have got, they say rubbish. There is not one country with a bigger budget deficit in any major economy. Why is that the case? Because they didn't fix the roof when the sun was shining. And it's no good. It's no good his pretending that these international factors were some sort of surprise. He knew there was a world recession when he made those utterly useless forecasts in the November pre-budget report last year. We now know what he told us was a complete work of fiction. Just take one figure, the growth forecast, which he told us was going to be minus 1%, he's had to downgrade to minus 3.5%. That is one of the biggest downgrades in the history of forecasting. These figures are so bad that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have had to do a spectacular U-turn. For years, they have lectured us that coming off the government spending programmes means swinging cuts. Minister after minister has stood at that dispatch box and said any attempt, any try to come off the government's rate of growth of spending means you're being savage or inhuman. And now they are doing it themselves. That is right. They have just... That's what they were all cheering in that rather pathetic cheer at the end of the budget speech. They've just announced over £10 billion of cuts over 2 years. Now, for years, this was the Prime Minister's great dividing line. This was he's suddenly on the wrong side of his own dividing line. After today, no one will ever believe a word they say about spending cuts ever again. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this budget still doesn't do enough to get the public finances under control. In 2 words, it is completely inadequate. Instead of putting up taxes in 2011, why doesn't he get to grips with spending now and next year? And look at the consequences of failing to deal with spending. Look at the tax rises he's announced today. Now, of course, they claim it's just the rich that are going to pay. And by the way, he's just broken a manifesto promise not to put up the top rate of tax. But people expect that from this lot anyway. But look at the other taxes. Look at the tax on beer. That's going to hit every drinker in every pub. Look at the tax on petrol. They're reintroducing the fuel duty exercise. That is going to hit... escalator. That is going to hit everyone who has to drive to work. These people aren't rich. These people have to work hard, and they're going to pay the price for Labour's failure. These aren't taxes for the few, they're taxes for the many, introduced by this Labour Prime Minister. But you know what stands out most about today's budget is how every single argument, every single prediction they have told us about has turned out to be wrong. They told us the recession would be less severe than the 1990s. I've lost count of the times the Prime Minister's told me over that dispatch box. Well, perhaps you'd like to look at page 200 of the Red Book, and I quote, "The current downturn is forecast to be much deeper than that of the early 1990s. Condemned by his own Red Book. This is worse than the 70s, this is worse than the 80s or the 90s. This isn't just boom and bust, it's the worst boom and bust ever." Then they told us in that November budget report that the recession would be over by the end of June. The Chancellor actually said in November, I don't know, he doesn't want to remember what he said in November, he said that growth would start early as a direct result of the cut in VAT. So by the government's own criteria, the VAT cut has failed. The money was wasted and our debt is higher as a result. Now what about the last big argument? The one the Prime Minister tried to get off the ground before the G20. Britain, we were told, was heading for another great fiscal stimulus. Well, where is it? We're missing something. There isn't a fiscal stimulus here. There's a couple of extra billion added to what he'd already announced. This is less than the cut in next year's capital budget. This isn't a stimulus, it's a delayed tax rise and a delayed spending cut. He couldn't do a proper stimulus because he'd run out of money. He sits there shaking his head. He's the only person in Britain who doesn't realise how ridiculous he looked, wandering around the world telling governments everywhere else to open their chequebooks and start spending when the Governor of the Bank of England had taken his chequebook and torn it up in public. Now, of course we need schemes that will really help the unemployed and help British businesses large and small. We have been calling for a proper credit guarantee scheme for 6 months. But before we get carried away with the schemes announced today, I think we're entitled to ask what happened to the ones announced last year. The internship scheme, not working. The asset-backed security scheme, not working, but incidentally re-announced again today. What about Home Buy Direct? He told us about that today. Home Buy Direct was given another £80 million. What a treat for Home Buy Direct. Only one problem. We asked some parliamentary questions and found out by the 25th of March not a single sale had been made through the existing scheme. This is a fantastic. What about the homeowners' mortgage support scheme? Now, Peter Mandelson was meant to be in charge of that one. He knows a thing or two about getting a good mortgage. You think he might have succeeded? It was the centrepiece of the Queen's speech last year, and now, 4 months later, they've just announced it all over again. But still, not a single homeowner has received one single penny under this scheme. What a disgrace, what a callow farce from this government. And the Chancellor told us about his scrappage scheme. Let me see if I can get this right, the scrappage scheme. You take something, 10 years old, completely clapped out, it pumps out hot air, pollutes its surrounding, it's absolutely ripe for the knackers yard. What a brilliant idea!